Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
When we look back at mass casualty fires throughout history, we start to see repeating themes. And when we look at their root causes, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The chemical reaction of fire is neutral. It doesn't take sides, care about intent, or discriminate. It doesn't have egos to protect or financial motives pushing it forward. But people are a whole different animal. And while you might picture a gas can when we talk about accelerants, history reveals another fuel, one that drives disasters faster than any liquid ever could. That accelerant is greed. We saw it last week in the club Sunset fire, where owners locked exits to keep out freeloaders. We saw it in the Built to Burn series on the Beverly Hills Supper Club, where management oversold the venue far beyond its egress capacity to rake in bigger profits. And we saw it in Centralia, where half-hearted efforts to stop an underground mine fire, because of cost, condemned an entire town. Through it all, there's a thread that keeps getting severed, and that thread is humanity. When business owners, politicians, and executives care more about protecting the mighty dollar than protecting human life, when they allow shortcuts and look the other way, they invite catastrophe. They invite the flames. They build altars to greed and offer up innocent lives as the sacrifice. Today we're talking about a company that was progressive, one that genuinely cared about its workers' lives. And you'll hear about everything they did right, but it only takes one cut corner to ignite a crisis. Despite its reputation as a model town, when greed and apathy took center stage even briefly, hundreds of people died. This is the story of Dawson, New Mexico, a town that no longer exists. A town once defined by prosperity and promise. A town run by a company that didn't cut corners. Until it did. When greed stepped into the coal mines of Dawson, everything changed. What had been ground zero for an idyllic community became ground zero for not one, but two devastating explosions. This is the story of the Dawson mine disasters right now on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark, sooty landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and your tour guide through the smoldering ruins of other people's shortcuts.
And I can neither confirm or deny my involvement with this production.
A quick reminder, you can skip the ads, ethically, legally, and without violating any fire codes by joining our Patreon. Patreons get ad-free episodes, extra treats, and if you're in the inner sanctum for at least 30 days before December 31st, you'll receive this year's annual gift. We've ordered the prototype, and it's either going to be glorious or fire hazard. Either way, it'll be worth it. If ad-free episodes and questionable gifts don't spark joy for you, that's fine. We adore you anyway, you beautiful disaster. Other ways to support the podcast include checking out our spread shop. The link is in the show notes. Because nothing says I love you quite like giving your friends a t-shirt that reminds them you've been studying up on arson. You know, just in case they step out of line. There's only one thing on our holiday wish list this year, and it's a 5-star rating and review from you. I know for a fact that hundreds of you listen every week, and yet 56 reviews on Apple and 55 on Spotify. We can do better, my little pyromaniac friends. So drop a review, tell your friends, and help more people find the podcast, because the algorithm demands sacrifice, and apparently, stars count. Other algorithmically blessed offerings, such as likes, saves, comments, and shares on our YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook, also help us find our audience, so we can grow like high-interest debt, which incidentally, I'm trying to avoid while paying for the mountains of court records we currently need for upcoming cases. And one last reminder, before we talk about how greed made things go boom. If you aren't already following You Should Be Here, the podcast, Season 4 just dropped with over 20 binge-worthy true crime episodes from some seriously amazing creators. Every podcaster, including Crime to Burn, donated their episodes, and all the revenue goes directly to charities that support victims and their families. And it's completely free for you. So when you're done with this episode, go get your binge on and let your true crime obsession help give support to victims. You can find a link right in the show notes or just search You Should Be Here on your favorite podcatcher. Finally, send your fire stories, case suggestions, and thermodynamically unstable ideas to crimetoburn@gmail.com. May Steve bless your entropy. And now let's talk about a little patch of earth in northeast New Mexico. Once it was a place bustling with life, families, miners, laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But today it's something else entirely. All that remains of Dawson is a field of iron crosses, punctuated by the occasional headstone, each one marking a life that ended in one of America's vanished towns. Dawson, New Mexico isn't a ghost town in the traditional sense. There are no hollowed-out buildings or storefronts left behind to tell its story. Every structure was razed when the coal mine that birthed the town and sustained it permanently shut down. But the people who were laid to rest in what was once the churchyard, they remain. Their grave markers stand steadfast in the New Mexico sun, guarding the same ground where many of them drew their last breath. Roughly 600 markers are all that's left of Dawson. And many of those 600 souls were lost on just 2 days in the town's history, October 22nd, 1913, and February 8th, 1923. 2 explosions, 10 years apart, that together claimed 383 lives. Dawson wasn't just marred by disaster, it was forced to live through a devastating encore. This is a story about mining, explosions, and labor rights, about the men who helped fuel America's Industrial Revolution, and the corners that were cut in the name of progress. This is the story of the Dawson mine explosions. My primary source for this episode is Crosses of Iron, the tragic story of Dawson, New Mexico and its twin mining disasters by Nick Pappas. It's hands down the best resource if you want to dig deeper than we can go into a single podcast episode. I highly recommend reading it over listening to the audiobook though. I was not a big fan of the narration, but the book itself is fantastic. As always, all of my sources, including Crosses of Iron, are listed in the show notes. I did try to reach out to the author for comment, but unfortunately the contact form on his website kept giving me error messages, and I couldn't find an alternative email. So Mr. Pappas, if you happen to be listening, I do occasionally feature author interviews on Crime to Burn, and I would love to discuss your incredible research on these tragedies. You can reach me anytime at crimetoburn@gmail.com. Now, when I think of coal mines as a Mid-Atlantic girl, my mind immediately goes to West Virginia and Pennsylvania. But the truth is, coal mining in the United States wasn't isolated to Appalachia. Mines sprang up across the country, anywhere the right mix of heat, pressure, and time buried carbon deep beneath the surface. Wherever nature conspired to hide the fuel beneath the mountains of Earth, corporations conspired to send men underground to bring it up to the surface. And one of those corporations was Phelps Dodge. By the early 1900s, Phelps Dodge had become one of the most powerful mining companies in the American Southwest. Copper was their crown jewel, but coal was the backbone that kept everything running, and Dawson, New Mexico was built to feed that demand. And in the early 1900s, corporations like Phelps Dodge didn't exactly have sterling reputations. You see, in many mining towns, especially across Appalachia, similar companies either didn't yet have HR departments, or if they did, they were run by sadists. Mining companies needed strong backs to get that fuel out of the ground, and the problem was coal tends to form in places people don't naturally want to live. The rocky slopes of a mountain aren't necessarily great for agriculture or for much of anything except risk and regret. So to solve their labor shortage, these companies started building towns, entire communities, where the men they needed could live with their families. The catch was that the company quickly realized it could exercise total control over those workers by paying them in company scrip instead of actual money. Those little tokens could buy you anything that the company wanted to sell you. Groceries from the company store, rent and company housing, clothes from the company warehouse. It was a living, but only as long as you stayed put. If your paycheck can only be spent at the place that issues it, your leverage to leave is non-existent. You can't take a scrip to another town and buy so much as a loaf of bread. In that sense, these company towns became kind of a legalized servitude. There was no saving for a better life, and retirement wasn't a dream so much as a euphemism for dying on the job. When miners did, their families were often evicted from the company housing within days, left destitute on the same ground their loved ones had died trying to dig through. But Phelps Dodge had a different idea of how a mining town should work. When they acquired the mines and the town that would later become what's now remembered as Dawson, they had some work to do. Because the place they bought, it wasn't exactly the model community that they'd later brag about. It was a patchwork of tar paper shacks, saloons, and brothels. Not exactly the kind of environment a company could advertise as family-friendly. Lucky for them, and yes, that is sarcasm so thick you could spread it on toast, the town conveniently burned to the ground, leaving behind a clean slate for something better. And I'll admit, what they built was better, by a lot. If you told a miner in Appalachia that a company was building brick houses for its workers, schools that are accredited, a 3-story general store, a community golf course, and a community swimming pool, and topping it all off with a massive opera house, you might have been laughed straight out of the saloon. But Phelps Dodge wasn't just building a town, they were building an image. One that said, we take care of our workers. And for a while, they actually did. And dig as I couldn't find a definitive answer as to whether Phelps Dodge paid their miners in scripts or cold hard cash. Based on Nick Pappas's Crosses of Iron, though, there's plenty of mention of workers having savings to fall back on during strikes, which makes me think they were paid in real money, but I honestly can't say for sure. Either way, the fact that Dawson's miners had something to save already put them ahead of most company towns where the only thing employees were saving was resentment. And despite their progressive approach to attracting workers and their families, Phelps Dodge still took a hard line against any kind of unionization. Don't get your labor laws on us. It seemed they believed that if they kept people happy with golf and swimming, they wouldn't have to deal with things like strikes or contract negotiations. And they were wrong, but not at first. And Phelps Dodge was in a position to make a boatload of money producing coke. Not the kind you cut with razors, but the kind you cut from the earth, purify, and ship down to copper smelting plants. Coke is the name for a purified form of coal, a cleaner, hotter-burning fuel. The demand at Dawson's mine was huge because copper smelting takes an enormous amount of coke. Again, the fuel kind, not the nose candy kind.
I was going to say, so does architecture, apparently.
And designing the carpet in hotels. And because the work of coal mining was just absolute balls, whether you were in Appalachia or Europe, rumors of this progressive town where families could carve out a real life spread fast. Men poured in from Italy, Greece, and Mexico, and they were sending money home, where word of Dawson's promise traveled with it across oceans and across languages and across desperation. More men boarded westbound ships, enduring month-long sea voyages and crossing a continent to chase a rumor of a better life. They came to New Mexico believing their futures lay underground, worming their way beneath the mountains to feed the smelters and their families. And for a time, Dawson seemed to live up to that legend. The pay was steady, the town was clean, and the company actually invested in its people. But for all its surface perfection, Dawson was still a mining town, and coal mining, no matter where you did it, was a killer. Explosions, roof collapses, gas leaks, runaway trolley cars, any of them could end a life in seconds. Even the air could kill you. Methane, carbon monoxide, and coal dust filled the tunnels, and one wrong move could turn an ordinary shift into a mass casualty. And Phelps Dodge knew that. To their credit, they tried to stay ahead of disaster. The company invested in new ventilation systems, safety inspections, sprinklers for coal dust suppression, all cutting-edge ideas for the time. They even held safety drills, brought in engineers, and prided themselves on the quality of their equipment. On paper, Dawson was one of the safest mining operations in the country. But safe is a relative term when the entire job takes place in a tunnel full of explosive dust. You see, coal dust, like flour, sugar, and most fine particulates, is explosive, but only when it's suspended in air. If you light a pile of coal dust that's on the floor, it'll burn. It's coal after all. But it's not likely to explode. But turn that same dust loose into the air, and you've created something entirely different, a cloud with amazing potential energy just waiting for a spark. And how did miners break apart all that rock to get the coal out? Well, they blasted it. And blasting creates pressure waves, and those waves shake loose fugitive dust, as we call it in industrial settings, sending it swirling through the tunnels like a storm. One spark, one open flame, one ignition source, and that cloud becomes a bomb. The pressure wave from the first explosion knocks loose more dust, which feeds into the air, feeding the next blast, and then the next. A self-propelling chain reaction until you're no longer a mining operation, you're a front-page horror story. And here's the thing, it's not actually that hard to keep the dust from going airborne. All you gotta do is get it wet. Yes, sogginess is a valid fire prevention strategy in some settings. Wet dust does not liberate into the air, it stays stuck to the ground. And it takes a lot more energy to ignite because the heat first has to drive out all of the moisture. So coal dust explosions can be prevented with what we'll politely call aggressive urination, but that wasn't the strategy that Phelps Dodge used. Instead, they spent a small fortune routing sprinkler lines through the mines, a whole underground plumbing network designed to keep the coal dust damp, heavy, and decidedly non-explodey. And that wasn't all they did to make sure they had the safest operation in the industry. Phelps Dodge built training tunnels, real mine shafts with windows cut into the walls so instructors could observe rescue drills as they happened underground. They installed escape shafts with ladders. They interconnected their mines to give workers multiple egress routes. They trained miners in rescue techniques and first aid, and they invested in some of the most advanced safety equipment money could buy. On paper, Dawson wasn't just a model town, it was a model mine. And while dust might have been the most energetic hazard, it wasn't the most common. That honor went to the gases. When you liberate coal from rock, you liberate everything that's been trapped in that rock for millions of years. And that could include some truly nasty stuff. Methane, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and even hydrogen sulfide. Then add explosives to the mix. You're detonating pyrotechnics that chew up oxygen and release a cocktail of combustion gases in tunnels where airflow is already limited.
That happened to me last week when my dog farted into the bed jet.
Oh my god, yes, I was there for that, and it was not pleasant. We should have evacuated, to be honest, it was that bad. The result? A rapidly intensifying, suffocating environment where one wrong calculation could turn deadly in minutes. Many miners didn't die from explosions at all. They died quietly from carbon monoxide, toxic gases, or a simple lack of oxygen. But Phelps Dodge was genuinely committed to safety, or at least that's what they set out to prove. They poured money into insanely robust ventilation systems designed to constantly pump fresh air deep into the mines while venting out the deadly explosive gases. But simply investing in equipment wasn't enough. So Phelps Dodge also had procedures. They didn't just check for gases once in a while, they checked them constantly. Early miners used safety lanterns, watching how the flame bent or changed color to detect methane or low oxygen. Later came chemical test tubes and eventually electrical gas detectors. But at Dawson, they took it a step further. The company followed very strict blasting procedures. No blasting was allowed while miners were underground. Instead, during the workday, miners drilled the blast holes and marked the locations. When the shift ended and the mine was cleared, a specialized crew went in, wiring the blasting caps and connected the circuits to a safe location on the surface. That way, if a blast triggered a rockfall or released explosive gases, the men who drilled the holes weren't the ones paying the price. But this method, while safest, had some real ramifications. The next day, miners would return to the tunnels and load the coal that had been blasted loose overnight. And they were paid by weight, not by the hour, so every single shovel full mattered. Once they'd cleared what they could reach with shovels and pickaxes, they had to wait until the next day for another blast to free up more coal. It was safer, absolutely, but it also meant there was a ceiling on how much money a miner could make in a single day. The faster the blasts came, the more coal they could dig and the more money they could bring home. And in an industry where every paycheck determined whether your family ate or went hungry, the pressure to move faster was always simmering just below the surface. And this is what set into motion the events of October 22nd, 1913. According to survivor George Mavroidis, he was working in Stag Canyon Mine No. 2, where the explosion occurred. Here's his account, quoted directly from Crosses of Iron. "I was working when there came a sudden rush of air and my light went out," he said. "Gas followed the air. Men dropped all around me. I fell unconscious, and 16 men died around me. I was stronger than they. I crawled to each of them and made sure they were dead. I was hardly able to breathe. I could not rise."
You made sure they were dead?
Then everything went black. When I awakened again, I was in the mine office and Dr. Brady and a nurse were attending to me. Mavroidis was one of only 23 men to survive the explosion that killed 263 of his fellow miners. But his story doesn't end in peace. Just 6 months later, the man who had escaped death underground was killed above it during the Ludlow Massacre on April 20th, 1914, when a gun battle erupted in Ludlow, Colorado between the National Guard and striking miners. When the smoke cleared, the tent colony lay in ashes, and 24 people were dead, including 2 women and 11 children. Mavroidis was taken prisoner by the National Guard, and he was struck over the head with a rifle and then allegedly shot in the back, because that's how the government handled labor disputes in 1914. I bet they didn't teach you that in history class. On October 22nd, company executive Thomas O'Brien was in his office when he heard the blast, even though he was nearly a mile away from mine No. 2. From his window, he saw flames spit from the mouth of the mine, and within seconds he activated the emergency siren. That sound was the signal every miner in Dawson dreaded because it meant disaster. Across the entire operation, men dropped their tools and ran toward mine No. 2. But when they reached it, the entrance was a wall of debris, timbers, rock, twisted rail, completely impassable. No one could get in. The rescuers quickly organized, sending a crew toward the air shaft located about a mile north of the main entrance. This shaft dropped 250 feet straight down and was designed for exactly this kind of emergency, with a ladder leading into the tunnels below. But when the rescue team arrived, the shaft wasn't pulling fresh air. It was belching poisonous gas. That meant only one thing. The giant fans that circulated air through the mine had stopped working. Inside, the men weren't just trapped, they were suffocating as crews above ground fought to clear the debris choking the main entrance. But O'Brien and his men wasted no time. They donned oxygen helmets, the heavy brass and leather kind that look more like diving gear than safety gear. And they rushed into mine No. 5, which connected to mine No. 2 through a shared tunnel system. Their hope was simple. If they couldn't reach the trapped men through the main entrance, maybe they could cut through from the adjoining mine and drag survivors to safety. But that hope didn't last long. When they reached the junction, they found the connecting passageway completely blocked, choked with rock, timber, and debris just like the main entrance. The force of the explosion had sealed the men inside the mine. Because the timber supports holding up the walls and the ceiling had been destroyed in the blast, progress into the mine was agonizingly slow. Every few feet, rescuers had to stop and install new timbers to keep the tunnels from collapsing on top of them. 7 hours after the explosion, they had only advanced about 100 feet into the mine. But there, against all odds, they found 5 men alive and managed to bring them to the surface. As word of the disaster spread, miners from neighboring camps rushed toward Dawson to help. But not everyone was welcome. Several men known for their involvement in union organizing or so-called labor agitators were stopped at the town's edge and refused entry. Their offers of help were sternly and uncharitably rebuffed. Even in tragedy, Phelps Dodge was determined to control the narrative. And maybe the narrative around Phelps Dodge, even today, is still a little too controlled. The people who contributed to Crosses of Iron were for the most part children at the time of the explosions, And their memories of Dawson were colorful, nostalgic, stories of a safe, happy little company town. But not every family likely remembers Dawson that way, because in 1913, black miners in Dawson were not treated equally. They were segregated to an area that, even in the company's own public documents, was called Coontown. It's a practice that's jaw-dropping by today's standards, but back then, company officials actually celebrated it as progress. They proudly noted that black families were allowed to shop at the same store and use the same facilities as the white miners, patting themselves on the back for their supposed enlightenment. But when the explosions of October 1913 ripped through mine number 2, it killed nearly 1/3 of Dawson's black miners. That's 10 men, was 1/3 of the black workforce, and they were gone in an instant. And after that, their numbers dwindled. By the time Dawson closed in 1950, there were no black families left. So maybe Phelps Dodge's model town wasn't as equitable as they liked to believe. As rescuers worked to clear the mine passageway, they were racing against more than just time. They were racing against what miners called black damp. Black damp is a deadly buildup of carbon dioxide and nitrogen that forms when oxygen is consumed faster than it's replaced. It doesn't burn, it doesn't explode, it just suffocates. The huge ventilation fan that normally kept the air clear of these gases had been damaged in the explosion. Phelps Dodge had actually tried to make the fan explosion-proof, positioning it far enough from the mine mouth to avoid a direct blast, and enclosing it in what they called a fireproof housing of masonry and concrete, and even adding explosion doors that were supposed to vent pressure outward if a blast occurred to protect the fan's workings. And it worked, sort of. The fan itself survived, but the housing around it didn't, and the damage meant that the fan couldn't draw air through the mine. So inside, the trapped miners weren't just waiting, they were slowly running out of air. While crews raced to repair the damaged fan, rescuers had to rely on oxygen helmets, heavy, awkward, and hot. Each one only offered about an hour of breathable air, which meant rescuers had to work in short bursts before returning to the surface or risk suffocating themselves. By mid-afternoon the following day, they had managed to pull 22 men alive from the depths of the mine, but more than 200 men were either dead or still unaccounted for. Outside the entrance, mothers stood with their children, clutching rosaries and each other's hands, and praying that the next man carried out of the darkness alive would be theirs. By 26 hours after the explosion, hope was fading. At this point, it had been hours since rescuers had found anyone alive. And then, deep in the darkness, a sound. The shuffle of hooves? Rescuers stumbled upon a mine mule, alive and standing, its coat caked in soot. The mule was walked out of the mine on its own power and immediately began braying for food. It's a small miracle, but it was enough to keep the rescuers going. And just 1 hour later, they found one more survivor, Jose Fernandez. He was unconscious, but he was alive. And after treatment, he did recover. And he was the very last man pulled from Stag Canyon Mine number 2 alive. But even after the last survivor was found, the rescuers kept searching. 2 volunteer rescue workers from a neighboring camp refused orders to return to the surface and conserve what little oxygen they had left in their oxygen helmets. Instead, they pressed deeper into the tunnels, determined to keep looking until their air finally ran out. They removed their helmets and were quickly overcome by the toxic gases, and both men died underground. The rescue efforts continued for days, but no more survivors were ever found. More than 200 men, fathers, brothers, and sons, were gone in one horrific instant. But how had it happened? Early theories suggested that the explosion was caused by a buildup of methane, a flammable gas that seeps naturally from coal seams. You see, at the time, electric or battery-powered headlamps were still mostly experimental, and I found no evidence that they were in use at Dawson. Instead, miners of the time relied on carbide headlamps, also called acetylene lamps. And these worked by dripping water onto calcium carbide inside a small chamber on the miner's cap. The chemical reaction released acetylene gas, which was forced through a tiny nozzle and ignited at the tip, producing a bright, steady flame. The flame could even be adjusted by a simple twist to let more water drip effectively dimming or brightening your personal torch. The problem, of course, was that this was still an open flame, the same kind of fire hazard miners had been living with since the days of oil lamps. And in a mine known for unpredictable bursts of methane gas seeping from the rock, that can be a deadly combination. So it's no surprise that the first theory was the most obvious one, a methane pocket ignited by a miner's headlamp. But the real story behind the explosion turned out to be a little more criminal. Remember how miners had to wait until the overnight blasting was finished before they could haul more coal to the surface, and how that meant waiting to earn more pay? Well, normally the miners would drill the blast holes, pack the charges, but the blasting caps wouldn't be wired until after their shift ended. Only the night crew handled that part. But according to the investigation that followed the explosion, someone decided they didn't want to wait. In their impatience for more coal and more money, they rigged their own blasting circuit, bypassing the company's safety protocols entirely. Investigators determined that the charge had been wired directly to the live trolley line, the same electrical line that powered the mine's locomotives. When a trolley rolled past it, it completed the circuit and triggered the blast. Reports also noted that the levels of fugitive coal dust, the fine airborne powder that turns a fire into an explosion, were unusually high. Some rescuers and inspectors accused the company of neglecting to use the dust wetting sprinklers as often as required. The result was catastrophic. The initial blast ignited a massive cloud of coal dust, setting off a chain reaction explosion that ripped through the mine with unstoppable force. Despite the fact that investigators found Phelps Dodge not liable for the explosion, the company moved quickly to make settlements with the families of the dead, and they covered burial costs for the victims interred at Dawson. But the aftermath was brutal. Many of the miners were related: fathers, sons, brothers, cousins. So some families lost multiple generations in a single day. And there were no child labor laws yet. So the youngest victim was just 12 years old, a trapper boy named Juan Baca. Perfectly old enough for mining work in 2013, apparently. But after the funerals, after the settlements, there was still work to be done. There was coke to be produced, and without coal coming out of Dawson, the smelters down the line were going hungry. So once again the mines reopened. The drills whined, the carts rattled, and the men went back underground. Wiser, one would hope. Better informed about just how important it was to control coal dust and follow every safety rule like they were written in blood. But as history keeps reminding us, some lessons are much harder to learn than others. And 10 years later, on February 8, 1923, Dawson was struck by another devastating explosion, this time in Stag Canyon Mine No. 1. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a blast tore through the tunnels, ultimately claiming the lives of another 120 miners. But unlike the first disaster, there was no impatient worker cutting corners for a few extra pennies. This time the cause was accidental, but the severity of what followed fell squarely on the shoulders of the mine's operators. The scene from 1913 repeated itself. Worried wives, many with small children in tow, crowded around the mine entrance, praying that the next man carried out would be theirs. And inside, rescuers once again faced the exhausting, dangerous work of digging through debris and choking dust in search of survivors. This time, roughly 200 men made it out alive. The explosion that killed the rest had been triggered by something almost absurd in its simplicity: a trolley accident. So how did a simple trolley accident cause a catastrophe that claimed more than 100 lives? The answer is a familiar one: fugitive dust. New Mexico is in the middle of a cold snap, the kind that bites through layers and freezes everything it touches. It was so cold, in fact, that the sprinkler lines designed to keep the coal dust damp and non-explosive had frozen solid. With the dry dust, temperatures low, and air crisp enough to hold a static charge, the conditions underground were perfect, a powder keg waiting for a spark. And when that spark came, the Dawson mine got an encore performance from disaster. A trolley car had derailed on the tracks and struck the timbers supporting the live trolley wires. And when it did, sparks flew. and just enough of that dry, fugitive dust was kicked up to ignite. The initial blast created a pressure wave that lifted even more dust into the air, and that dust exploded. One explosion triggered the next in a deadly chain reaction that raced through the tunnels with unstoppable force. Dawson, a town run by a company that prided itself on safety and comfort, a company that called itself employee-focused and safety-forward, somehow still managed to earn two of the worst mining tragedies in New Mexico's history, just 10 years apart. And the fallout was intense. The push for unions to enter Dawson grew, and miners eventually went on strike. It's not enough to give people swimming pools and accredited schools if you can't keep them alive. After 2 catastrophic explosions, labor organizers found much more receptive ears in Dawson. Eventually, Phelps Dodge compromised with unions, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Because after World War II, the demand for coal was plummeting. Smelters were turning to natural gas and oil, and labor forces at coal mines were shrinking as companies cut costs to stay afloat. And when the strikes came, they hurt everyone. Phelps Dodge eventually called labor's bluff, choosing to close the Dawson mine rather than find a profitable middle ground if one even existed in that environment. The company had, in fairness, invested heavily in safety. They built the best systems their era could imagine. But one impatient miner, and one inspector who underestimated the danger of dry air, and one forgotten sprinkler line. That's all it takes. Families still living in Dawson were given 30 days to pack up and leave. Pensions were guaranteed, but only for men over 60 who'd worked the previous year, leaving many aging miners with no savings, no job, and nowhere to go. As people scattered, Phelps Dodge tried to wring every last cent from what remained. Salvage crews came in and stripped Dawson bare. Mining equipment, houses, they even dismantled the buildings, taking every scrap of what had once been Dawson. And everything was sold off. Everything except the graves. Those stayed. 600 iron crosses in the New Mexico sun, guarding the ground where hundreds of men took their final breaths. 2 days, October 22nd, 1913, and February 8th, 1923, cost 383 lives. And today, that field of crosses is all that remains of Dawson, New Mexico, as a reminder of what happens when greed, apathy, or simple human error turns progress into tragedy. This has been the story of the Dawson mine explosions on Crime to Burn.
Testes. 1, 2.
You're good.
3.
And I'm the reason OSHA invented paperwork?
What did I do? I do not want to be the human embodiment of whatever that is. And I'm wearing pants. It's too early for beer.
And I'm the reason OSHA added the phrase, including but not limited to. Okay.
I don't know if that's the best vocal warm-up. I think disaster has more than one syllable.
Did I say it with one syllable?
Somehow, we managed. I think it has 3.
She's about to launch herself at someone, I can tell.
Have you ever tried clearing your throat in reverse?
How do you do that?
I don't think that was even in reverse. Was it?
I don't know. How do you clear your throat in reverse?
You would be breathing in. You shouldn't do that.
I don't think that's going to work either.
This is why we don't record before noon. For some reason, I'm the voice of reason before noon, and then you take over for the rest of the day.
Yeah, I don't wake up very logical or vocal. So when you're done with this episode, go and binge on
pork pie. Have you ever aggressively urinated?
Yeah. Methane, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and each...
Chupacabras?
Yep, chupacabras.
Yeah, I'm gonna cramp.
You want me to rub it? And tickle you with feathers. 200 men made it out alive.
That made it out alive.
It did. The kind that bites through layers and freezes metal solid. It was so cold, in fact, that
Isn't metal already solid?
Yeah.
This has been a message from Steve, The patron saint of questionable decisions and preventable fires, Steve would like to remind you that while greed and apathy can destroy entire towns, so can you, Chad, if you keep microwaving aluminum wrap burritos. If your vibe includes ignoring warning labels, stacking extension cords like Jenga blocks, or saying, "Hold my beer while I light this," then congratulations, you might be the problem. Remember, "it's probably fine" is not a phrase that should be reassuring. And until next time, may your sprinklers flow freely, may your dust stay damp. This episode of Crime to Burn is brought to you by Sogginess, nature's most underappreciated fire protection strategy. Remember, when life feels dry and combustible, just add water, lots of it, everywhere. Got coal dust? Get soggy. Got a spark? Get soggy. Got emotions? You might already be soggy. Because nothing says safety like the slow, squelchy confidence of knowing your environment is too damp to ignite. Why do you hurt me like this? Sogginess, preventing explosions since forever, and proudly partnered with our subsidiary, Aggressive Urination LLC. Whether you're trapped in a mine or just in a meeting that could have been an email, remember, airflow saves lives. Proudly sponsored by Oxygen, carbon dioxide's more popular cousin. I don't have a beer to open, so here.
I don't know, the sound of the water bottle opening isn't as satisfying. Yeah, it's 9 in the morning. Crime to Burn is not fully awake yet.
Sometimes you gotta cram things where they'll fit in.
I am apolitical.
I don't think that's how you pronounce your name.
So, floaty balls are apparently the key to jumping timelines. I become naturally unhinged after breakfast and caffeine, but I have eaten nothing yet, and I have given up caffeine, so...
If it wasn't for alcohol, I'd have no social life.
Because I prefer Pizza Hut to Domino's. Unless Domino's wants to sponsor us, and then I could prefer them.
Well, at least you're loyal. Remember, sogginess saves lives.
Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay, Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes, in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
Hello, Twisted Humans. Do you find yourself wanting to know more about the latest murder, conspiracy, cult, or haunting? Then this is the podcast for you. I'm Alicia. And I'm Sierra, and this is Twisted and Uncorked.